The 2 Days of Darkness. How the Mongols Shattered Europe in 48 Hours. Atavi Horror Story Part 1 of 3. Based on the true events of April 9 to 11, 1241. Warning. This narrative contains graphic descriptions of medieval warfare and mass death. Prologue. The whispers that came before the storm. The winter of 1240 was colder than most remembered. Snow fell early across Eastern Europe, blanketing the forests of Poland and the plains of Hungary in white silence. But it was not the cold that made people huddle closer to their fires. It was the stories, the terrible, impossible stories that traveled with every refugee, every merchant, every priest who came from the east. Brother Matthias of Krakow, a Franciscan monk who kept meticulous records of his travels, wrote in his journal on December 15, 1240, "Today I encountered something that has shaken my faith to its very foundations. A merchant from Kiev, a man I have known for 15 years, a man of sound mind and steadfast character, sat across from me in the monastery refectory and wept like a child as he described what he had witnessed. The monk's hand trembled as he continued writing. He spoke of riders who appeared on the eastern horizon like a dark cloud, moving faster than seemed possible for any mounted force. He described arrows that fell from the sky like God's own rain of judgment, so many that they darkened the sun. He told me of cities, great cities of stone and wood, that burned so fiercely the very rocks melted and ran like water. He described pyramids, dear Lord in heaven, pyramids built not of cut stone but of human skulls, piled so high they could be seen for miles." Brother Matthias had initially dismissed these accounts as the exaggerated fears of simple people prone to superstition. But as winter deepened and more refugees arrived, the stories became impossible to ignore. They all described the same enemy. Horsemen from the distant steppes of Asia, warriors who fought unlike anything Europeans had ever encountered, an army that had never been defeated, that had conquered kingdoms stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe itself. The nobles of Poland and Hungary, however, remained skeptical. Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia, a man known for his military experience and level-headed judgment, reportedly laughed when his advisors brought him tales of the Mongol threat. "Nomads on ponies," he supposedly said, "frightening peasants with their strangeness. When they meet proper Christian knights in battle, they will break and run like all barbarians do." King Bela IV of Hungary was slightly more concerned, but not overly so. His kingdom was powerful, his army large and well-equipped. The Mongols would find Hungary a much harder nut to crack than the disorganized Russian principalities they had ravaged. Neither man understood what was coming for them. Neither man could have understood, because what was approaching was beyond their experience, beyond their comprehension, beyond anything in European military history. The Mongols were not barbarians. They were the most advanced, most disciplined, most sophisticated military force on the planet. They had spent decades perfecting the art of warfare, studying their enemies, adapting their tactics, refining their weapons and training. They moved with the precision of a clock mechanism, struck with the force of a lightning bolt, and disappeared like smoke when pursuit seemed possible. And in April of 1241, this perfected killing machine would demonstrate exactly what it could do when unleashed on European armies that still fought as their grandfathers had fought, with tactics centuries out of date and a confidence that was about to be shattered like glass. Chapter 1. The weapon that conquered the world. The bow that could kill at 350 yards. Before we can understand the horror of what happened in April 1241, we must first understand the weapon that made it possible. Not the men who wielded it, will get to them, but the weapon itself. The Mongol composite bow was not simply a tool for killing. It was a technological marvel, the culmination of thousands of years of steppe warfare refinement. To a European knight seeing one for the first time, it looked deceptively simple. A curved bow, perhaps 3.5 feet long when strung, shorter and cruder looking than the elegant longbows used by English archers. Many Europeans made the mistake of underestimating it. None of them made that mistake twice. The construction of a Mongol composite bow was an art form that took up to a year to complete. The core was bamboo, with horn on the belly facing the archer and sinew on the back, all bound together with animal glue. But this simple description doesn't capture the incredible complexity and sophistication of the design. The process began with selecting the right wood, usually bamboo, birch, or mulberry, which had to be seasoned for weeks in a dry environment. The wood formed the core, the skeleton of the bow, but wood alone would break if made short enough to use from horseback. That's where the other materials came in. Horn, typically from water buffalo, though sheep or cattle horn worked as well, was carefully shaped and attached to the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer. Horn has the unique property of being exceptionally good in compression, able to take enormous amounts of deformation without failure. When you drew the bow back, this horn compressed, storing tremendous energy. On the back of the bow, the side facing away from the archer, layers of sinew were applied. These tendons came from deer, elk, or mountain sheep, wild animals, whose tendons Mongol bowyers considered superior to those of domestic livestock. Sinew from wild animals like deer, moose, and mountain sheep were considered the strongest and best. The sinew had to be carefully prepared, separated into fibers, and then applied in multiple layers. When you drew the bow, the sinew stretched, storing energy in tension. When you released the string, both materials snapped back to their original shape simultaneously, the compressed horn expanding, the stretched sinew contracting, creating a release of energy far greater than wood alone could produce. The glue that held these layers together was made from fish bladders, which had proven through millennia to be highly capable of resisting moisture and was more durable than modern epoxy resins. The entire assembly was then wrapped in specially prepared birch bark to protect it from moisture, though even with this protection, composite bows could be damaged by rain or high humidity, which is why Mongol warriors carried their bows in leather cases when not in use. The result of this complex construction was a weapon of devastating power. Draw weights ranged from 100 to 166 pounds, producing arrow velocities sufficient for effective combat ranges exceeding 300 meters. To put that in perspective, a modern compound hunting bow typically has a draw weight of 60 to 70 pounds. The Mongol warriors were pulling back more than twice that weight and doing it repeatedly, shot after shot, while riding at full gallop. The effective range, the distance at which a skilled archer could reliably hit a man-sized target, was approximately 350 yards. The maximum range, using special lightweight flight arrows, could exceed 500 yards. By comparison, English longbows, which wouldn't become famous until nearly a century later at battles like Crécy and Agincourt, had an effective range of about 200 to 250 yards. In a battle, this range difference was everything. The Mongols could begin killing Europeans from distances where European arrows couldn't even reach them. By the time the Europeans closed to effective range for their own weapons, they had already been under fire for nearly 2 minutes, long enough for a skilled Mongol archer to empty an entire quiver. The arrows, specialized death. The bow itself was only half the equation. The arrows were equally sophisticated, and the Mongols carried a variety of types, each designed for specific purposes. Standard war arrows were approximately 80 to 100 centimeters long, about 30 to 40 inches. with birch shafts about 1 centimeter in diameter. Crane tail feathers were favored for fletching, though tail feathers of all birds were usable, with eagle feathers being particularly prized but difficult to acquire. The Mongols paid obsessive attention to details that European fletchers might ignore: the placement of the feathers, which part of the bird they came from, how they affected the arrow's rotation in flight. But the real variety came in the arrowheads. Armor-piercing arrows had narrow, hardened steel tips designed to punch through chainmail or even penetrate plate armor at close range. These were typically used against heavily armored knights. Broadhead arrows had wide, flat tips designed to cause maximum tissue damage against unarmored or lightly armored targets. These created terrible wounds that were difficult to treat and often fatal from blood loss even if they didn't hit vital organs immediately. Whistling arrows had special carved tips that created a distinctive sound in flight. These served multiple purposes. They could be used to signal other Mongol units, to coordinate timing of attacks, or, most terrifyingly, to create psychological fear. Imagine being a European soldier, standing in formation, and hearing that sound approaching, growing louder, knowing that death was flying through the air toward you but unable to see it coming until too late. Fire arrows were dipped in naphtha or other flammable substances and ignited before firing. These were used to set buildings, siege engines, or enemy encampments ablaze. Blunt arrows with rounded tips were used for hunting small game without damaging the pelt, but could also be used in warfare to cause blunt trauma through armor. Each Mongol warrior carried between 60 and 80 arrows distributed among multiple quivers. Some sources suggest that warriors carried 2 or even 3 bows, a longer, heavier bow for maximum range work, and shorter, lighter bows for mounted combat at closer distances. The training made killers from birth. The sophistication of the weapons would have been useless without warriors capable of wielding them effectively. This is where the Mongol system truly shone, because every Mongol was a soldier from the moment they could walk. Mongol children learned to ride before they learned to walk properly. By age 3, they were comfortable on horseback. By age 5, they began learning archery. By age 10, they could hit moving targets while riding at a gallop. By age 15, they were ready to join the army. But by that point, they had already logged thousands of hours of training that would shame most professional soldiers. The training was not random or haphazard. It was systematic, progressive, and focused entirely on developing the specific skills needed for mounted archery warfare. Young Mongols practiced shooting at stationary targets from horseback, first at a walk, then at a trot, then at a gallop. They learned to shoot forward, to the sides, and most famously, backwards over their shoulders while fleeing. This backward shot, called the Parthian shot after an earlier steppe people who had used the same technique, was particularly devastating in combat. They practiced rapid firing, trying to get off as many accurate shots as possible in a short time. Skilled Mongol archers could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute while galloping at full speed. Think about that for a moment. 1 arrow every 5 or 6 seconds, each one potentially lethal, all while riding a horse at full speed over uneven ground. This rate of fire was far superior to European crossbowmen, who might manage 2 or 3 shots per minute at best, and even superior to English longbowmen who, while faster than crossbowmen, still couldn't match the Mongol rate of fire while mounted. They learned to time their shots for the moment when all 4 of the horse's feet were off the ground during a gallop, that split second when the motion was smoothest and the aim steadiest. This level of precision came only from years of practice. They practiced in all weather conditions: rain, snow, extreme heat, high winds. They practiced by day and by night. They practiced until shooting from horseback was as natural as breathing, until they could do it without conscious thought. reacting instantly to threats and opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, they practiced as units, not just as individuals. While European knights trained for personal glory in individual combat, Mongols trained to fight as coordinated teams. They learned to respond instantly to flag signals from commanders. They learned to execute complex maneuvers, feigned retreats, encirclements, flanking attacks, with multiple units moving in perfect synchronization. The organization, an army that moved as one. The Mongol military organization was based on a decimal system that made command and control remarkably efficient. The smallest unit was the arban, 10 men who typically came from the same tribe or region, who knew each other intimately, who would fight together for years or even decades. These 10 men shared responsibility. If one fled in battle, all 10 would be executed. This created bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that were incredibly strong. 10 arbans formed a jagan of 100 men, commanded by an officer who had proven himself in battle. 10 jaguns formed a minghan of 1,000 men. 10 minghans formed a chuman of 10,000 men, the standard Mongol field army. But these weren't just administrative divisions. Each level had its own signals, its own tactics, its own role in battle. A chuman could split into multiple minghans operating independently, then reassemble rapidly. A minghan could divide into jaguns for a complex flanking maneuver. Arbans could operate alone as scouts or raiders. Communication across the structure used a sophisticated system of flag signals visible from great distances. Commanders positioned on high ground could see the entire battlefield and direct the movements of thousands of men in real time, responding to changing conditions faster than any European army could manage. Every man knew his place in this structure. Every man knew the standard signals and maneuvers. There was no confusion, no disorder, no knights charging off on their own seeking personal glory. The Mongols moved as a single organism with 10,000 bodies. This level of organization and discipline was centuries ahead of European military practice. European armies were loose collections of feudal contingents, each following their own lord, often with conflicting objectives and little coordination. When European knights charged, they did so in a mob, not a formation. When they fell back, it often became a rout. The Mongols, by contrast, could execute a fighting retreat that looked like a rout but was actually a carefully controlled maneuver designed to draw the enemy into a trap. They could surround an enemy force from multiple directions simultaneously, with the timing so perfect that all attacking units hit at the same moment. They could divide their forces, operate independently for days or weeks, then converge on a target with clockwork precision. The tactics, the science of slaughter. All of these advantages, the superior weapons, the lifetime training, the organizational sophistication, came together in tactical systems that had been refined over decades of warfare across Asia. The foundation of Mongol tactics was mobility. They almost never fought where the enemy wanted to fight. They chose the time, place, and circumstances of battle, forcing their opponents to react to them rather than executing their own plans. Before battle, Mongol scouts, the Mangadai, would survey the terrain extensively, identifying good positions for archers, escape routes, places to hide reserves. While European armies blundered forward hoping to find the enemy, the Mongols knew exactly where the Europeans were, how many they numbered, how they were organized, and what their probable movements would be. The most famous Mongol tactic was the feigned retreat. This wasn't really a trick. It was more like judo, using the enemy's own aggression and expectations against them. Here's how it worked in practice. A relatively small force of Mongol light cavalry would approach the European position and begin firing arrows. The Europeans, trained to stand their ground and fight, would initially hold position. But the Mongols would continue harassing them, killing men, wounding horses, creating casualties without ever closing to sword range. Eventually, sometimes after hours, sometimes after days, the European commanders would lose patience. Knights did not become knights to stand still and be shot at like targets. They became knights to charge, to close with the enemy, to use their swords and lances. The natural European response to mounted archers was to charge them, relying on heavy armor and powerful war horses to smash through the lighter cavalry. So the Europeans would charge. And the moment they did, the Mongols would turn and flee, but not in panic. They would maintain just enough distance to stay ahead of the pursuing knights, occasionally turning to fire backward shots that would wound but not stop the pursuit. The chase might continue for miles, with the Mongols always staying frustratingly out of reach. The European knights, in their 60-pound suits of armor, riding horses that were also armored, would slowly exhaust themselves. Their formation would string out as faster horses pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind. They would become separated from their infantry support, from their archers, from any defensive position they might have held. And then, when the Europeans were exhausted, disorganized, and far from any support, the trap would spring. The fleeing Mongols would suddenly wheel about. Fresh cavalry would emerge from hidden positions on both flanks. More Mongols would appear behind the Europeans, cutting off their retreat. In seconds, the pursuing force would find itself surrounded by a swirling mass of mounted archers. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. The Mongols would circle their trapped prey at a distance of 100 to 200 yards, just beyond effective range for most European weapons, but well within range for their composite bows. They would shoot methodically, rotating fresh warriors to the front as others went to rearm, maintaining a constant stream of arrows pouring into the trapped Europeans from all directions. If the Europeans tried to charge in any direction, the Mongols in that direction would simply move away, maintaining the killing distance, while arrows continued to pour in from the other sides. If the Europeans tried to retreat, they would be shot from behind. If they dismounted to form a defensive position with shields locked together, they became stationary targets, unable to move as the arrows found gaps in their defense. The encirclement would continue for hours if necessary, until every man and horse was dead or dying. It was methodical. It was scientific. It was perfect. The 2 days of darkness. How the Mongols shattered Europe in 48 hours. Part 2. The Field of Legnica, April 9th, 1241, where 25,000 Christian knights learned that courage is not enough. Chapter 3. April 9th, 1241 morning. The armies converge. The dawn of April 9th, 1241, broke cold and clear over the plains of Legnica Pole, the field of Legnica in Lower Silesia. Morning mist rose from the ground, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed almost peaceful. Birds sang in the nearby forests. Spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the meadows. Within hours, this peaceful landscape would be transformed into one of the greatest killing grounds in European history. Duke Henry II the Pious rose before dawn, as was his custom before battle. He was 44 years old, a veteran of numerous campaigns, a man who had proven his courage and skill many times. He was called the Pious because of his genuine religious devotion. He attended Mass daily, endowed monasteries, and tried to rule with Christian virtue. But he was no pacifist. When necessary, he could be as ruthless as any medieval warlord. This morning, Henry prayed longer than usual. He had a sense, whether from military instinct or divine premonition, that today would be critical. His scouts had reported that the Mongol force was nearby and approaching. More importantly, messengers had arrived the previous evening with news that King Wenceslas of Bohemia was marching to join him with an army of 50,000 men. Wenceslas was just 1 day's march away. If Henry could delay the Mongols for 24 hours, if he could avoid battle today and link up with Wenceslas tomorrow, they would outnumber the Mongol diversion force by nearly 4-1. With those numbers, victory would be certain. But delaying the Mongols was easier said than done. Henry's own force numbered between 25,000 and 30,000 men, a substantial army by medieval standards. It included Polish cavalry, heavy knights and lighter cavalry from various Polish duchies, perhaps 5,000 strong. These were well-equipped warriors, many with mail armor, good horses, and years of combat experience. Knights of the military orders, several hundred Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, the elite of Christian military might. These were professional warriors who had taken religious vows, men who feared neither death nor pain because they believed they would go straight to heaven if they fell in battle against infidels. German cavalry, contingents from German nobles, perhaps 2,000 men, equally well-equipped as the Polish forces. Infantry, the bulk of the army, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men, consisting of spearmen, crossbowmen, and levied peasants with minimal armor and training. It was a typical European medieval army, strong in heavy cavalry, adequate in infantry, organized around feudal lines with each noble commanding his own retainers. Against this force came the Mongol diversionary army under Princes Kadin and Baidar. Estimates of its size vary wildly. Some sources suggest as few as 12,000 men, others as many as 20,000. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, around 15,000 to 18,000 warriors. But numbers don't tell the full story. Every single one of those Mongol warriors had been training for warfare since early childhood. Everyone had fought in multiple campaigns. Everyone was mounted on a hardy steppe pony that could outrun and outlast the larger European warhorses. And everyone was armed with the most advanced projectile weapon in the medieval world. The Mongols had no intention of fighting a fair battle. They had 1 day to destroy the Polish army before King Wenceslas could arrive with reinforcements. They had to win quickly, decisively, and with minimal casualties so they could continue south to rejoin Subutai in Hungary. For the Mongols, this was just another day's work. For the Europeans, it would be the end of everything. The European deployment. Around mid-morning, Duke Henry deployed his forces in the traditional European manner, a formation that had won countless battles against other European armies but was perfectly designed for the Mongols to exploit. The heavy cavalry, the knights and mounted men-at-arms, formed the center of the line. These were the strike force, the hammer that would smash the enemy. They sat atop their powerful warhorses, resplendent in armor that represented years of a blacksmith's work and wealth equivalent to several farms. Mail hauberks that weighed 40 to 50 pounds. Helms that protected the head but limited vision. Shields bearing the heraldic devices of dozens of noble families. Lances, swords, maces, close combat weapons because that's what knights were trained for. The infantry deployed on the flanks and front. Spearmen with their 10-foot pikes that were supposed to break cavalry charges. Crossbowmen who could fire their powerful bolts through armor, though slowly, painfully slowly, taking 30 seconds or more to reload each shot. Peasant levies with whatever weapons they could find, often just agricultural implements or crude spears. Behind the main line, Duke Henry positioned himself with his personal guard and a reserve of cavalry that could be committed when needed. It looked impressive. Banners snapped in the morning breeze. Armor gleamed in the spring sun. 25,000 men stood in ordered ranks, ready to defend Christian Europe against the eastern hordes. To the Mongol commanders observing from a nearby hill, it looked like a gift from heaven. Every European weakness on display, every tactical error already made before the battle even began. The Europeans were standing still, waiting to be shot at. They had split their forces into distinct units, cavalry separated from infantry, making coordination difficult. They were deployed for a frontal assault with no real plan for dealing with a mobile enemy who might not cooperate by standing still to be charged. Their cavalry, the core of their strength, was positioned where it could easily be drawn away from support. Princes Cadden and Bidar didn't need to consult with each other. They had both fought in dozens of battles. They knew exactly what to do. The plan had been refined over decades of warfare against enemies who fought very much like these Europeans. It was time to demonstrate why the Mongols had never lost a battle. The opening moves, setting the trap. The battle began around midday with what appeared to be a probing attack. A force of perhaps 2,000 Mongol light cavalry, mounted on small, unremarkable-looking ponies, without the impressive armor of European knights, approached the European position at a trot. They came within range of Henry's crossbowmen, about 300 yards out. The crossbowmen fired. Their bolts arced through the air, and a few Mongols fell from their saddles. But most of the shots missed. The range was long, the targets were moving, and crossbows, for all their power, were not particularly accurate weapons. The Mongols responded by forming a loose crescent and beginning to circle the European position at a distance of about 200 to 250 yards. As they rode, they began firing arrows. Not volley fire, not yet, but individualized shots, each archer choosing his own target. The arrows began to fall among the European lines. Here, a crossbowman fell with an arrow through his throat. There, a knight's horse screamed and collapsed, an arrow driven through its chest. The casualties were not catastrophic, maybe a dozen men in the first few minutes, but they were steady, constant, and impossible to prevent. The Europeans tried to respond. Crossbowmen reloaded and fired back, but their rate of fire was painfully slow. By the time a crossbowman cranked back his heavy bowstring and loaded another bolt, a Mongol archer could fire 6 arrows. It was like fighting a machine gun with a musket. After perhaps 20 minutes of this harassment, the Mongol force suddenly wheeled and rode back toward their own lines, disappearing over a low ridge. To the watching Europeans, this looked like a victory. The Eastern barbarians had probed the Christian lines and been driven off by the steadfast courage of Henry's soldiers. Cheers went up from the European ranks. Men clapped each other on the back, confident now that the tales of Mongol prowess were exaggerated. Duke Henry knew better. He had seen enough battles to recognize a feint when he saw one. But even he probably didn't realize the sophistication of the trap being set. 15 minutes later, the Mongols appeared again. A slightly larger force this time, perhaps 3,000 riders. They repeated the same maneuver, approaching to arrow range, circling, firing, withdrawing before the Europeans could effectively respond. This pattern continued for over an hour. Each time, the Mongols would approach, harass the European lines, kill a few men, then withdraw. Each time, the Europeans held their formation, endured the casualties, and congratulated themselves on not being drawn out of position. But Henry's knights were growing restless. European military culture valued aggressive action, not passive defense. Knights became knights to charge, to close with the enemy, to use their superior strength and armor in close combat. Standing still while peasants with bows shot at them from a safe distance was both tactically frustrating and culturally humiliating. The Mongols were counting on this. They understood European psychology perhaps better than the Europeans understood it themselves. Finally, around 2 p.m., the Mongols made what appeared to be a serious attack. A substantial force, perhaps half their total strength, 7,000 to 8,000 riders, approached the European lines, this time in a dense formation that suggested they meant to close to contact. The European crossbowmen fired volley after volley. Dozens of Mongols fell, but thousands more kept coming. They reached a distance of about 100 yards from the European lines, close enough that individual faces could be seen, close enough that it seemed certain a melee was about to begin. And then they turned and fled. Not an organized withdrawal, an apparent panic. The Mongol formation broke apart, riders turning their horses and fleeing back toward their own lines at full gallop. Some even dropped weapons as they fled, or at least, weapons appeared to be falling from fleeing riders. Later analysis would show these were probably old or damaged weapons deliberately dropped to enhance the illusion of panicked retreat. This was the moment Henry had to make his decision. He knew about the Mongol tactic of feigned retreat. His advisors had warned him about it. Refugees from the East had described it. But seeing it in reality was different, because it didn't look like a tactic. It looked like a rout. His men had held firm, the Mongols had charged and been driven back, and now they were fleeing in disarray. If he pursued immediately, he might be able to catch and destroy them before they could regroup. On the other hand, if it was a trap, his knights made the decision for him. Watching the enemy flee, seeing what looked like total victory within reach, they could not be restrained. Some of the younger, more eager knights began spurring their horses forward without waiting for orders. Within seconds, more joined them. Within a minute, the entire cavalry force, 5,000 to 7,000 mounted warriors, was charging forward in pursuit of the fleeing Mongols. Henry, realizing he had lost control of his cavalry, had no choice but to join the charge. To stay behind while his knights pursued the enemy would be seen as cowardice, would undermine his authority, might even result in some nobles accusing him of treachery. So Duke Henry II the Pious, veteran of many campaigns, devout Christian, ruler of one of Poland's most important duchies, lowered his lance and spurred his horse forward, joining the charge that would lead to his death and the destruction of his army. The trap was set. The jaws were about to close. Chapter 4. The slaughter begins. The chase into hell. The pursuing European knights covered the first quarter mile at full gallop, their heavy destriers thundering across the plain, throwing up clouds of dust. Each knight weighed, with armor and weapons, somewhere between 250 and 300 pounds. Each destrier, the heavy warhorse bred specifically for carrying armored knights, weighed 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. The ground shook with their passage. This was the legendary charge of medieval heavy cavalry, the tactic that had dominated European warfare for centuries. When these men crashed into enemy lines, they were supposed to smash through any resistance like a hammer through glass. But they weren't crashing into anything. The Mongols stayed tantalizingly just out of reach, perhaps 50 to 100 yards ahead of the nearest pursuing knights. Whenever it seemed the Europeans might catch up, the Mongols would increase their pace slightly, maintaining the perfect distance. And as they fled, the Mongols were firing backwards over their shoulders, the famous Parthian shot that had broken so many armies before. These weren't panicked shots. They were aimed, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. A knight would feel the impact as an arrow punched through his mail at the shoulder, the point driven deep into flesh by the enormous power of the composite bow. Another knight's horse would suddenly stumble and fall, an arrow through its neck. A third knight found his vision suddenly blocked as an arrow slammed into his helm, not penetrating the thick metal but driving the helmet sideways on his head, partially blinding him even as concussion addled his senses. The wounds were rarely immediately fatal, but they didn't need to be. A wounded knight slowed down. A wounded horse dropped out of the pursuit. Slowly but steadily, the European charge was being whittled down, casualties accumulating one arrow at a time. More importantly, the formation was coming apart. The fastest horses with the lightest loads pulled ahead. The slowest fell behind. What had started as a relatively cohesive charge was becoming a strung-out line nearly a mile long, with individual knights or small groups scattered across the plain. The infantry, weighted down by their equipment and unable to keep pace with galloping horses, fell farther and farther behind. Within 15 minutes, the cavalry was completely separated from any infantry support. Duke Henry, in the middle of the pack, must have realized the danger. He was experienced enough to recognize that his force was being led into a trap. But stopping a cavalry charge is nearly impossible. The horses are committed, running at full speed. The men behind push those in front forward. Knights who tried to rein in would be trampled by those behind them. The chase continued for over half an hour, covering nearly 3 miles. The European knights were exhausted now, their horses lathered with sweat, their own breathing labored inside their confining helms. Some of the older or less fit knights had already dropped out, unable to continue the pursuit. And then the Mongols created the smoke. The smoke screen blind terror. The exact method the Mongols used to create the massive smoke screen that engulfed the battlefield is still debated by historians. Some sources mention bundles of reeds and grass set on fire. Others reference primitive smoke bombs or naphtha-based devices that Chinese engineers might have provided. Some modern historians suggest the Mongols might have used a technique known from other battles, scattering sulfur on prepared firebeds which, when ignited, produced thick, choking smoke. Whatever the method, the result was catastrophic for the Europeans. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke suddenly billowed up across the plain, carried by the wind directly into the faces of the pursuing knights. Within seconds, visibility dropped to just a few feet. The smoke was thick enough to choke, burning eyes and lungs, making it impossible to see, impossible to breathe properly, impossible to maintain any sense of direction. The European charge came to a confused halt, knights pulling up their horses, trying desperately to see where they were, where the enemy was, where their comrades were. Shouts rang out through the smoke, men calling to each other, trying to maintain some kind of cohesion. But in the choking gray-black fog, every shout seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And then the arrows began to fall like rain from hell itself. The Mongols had never panicked. They had never fled. They had led the European knights exactly where they wanted them, into prepared killing ground, and now they surrounded the smoke-shrouded Christians on all sides. From every direction, Mongol archers fired volley after volley into the smoke. They couldn't see their individual targets, but they didn't need to. They knew approximately where the Europeans were trapped. Firing in volleys at high angles, the arrows arced through the air and came down like a deadly storm. Imagine being inside that cloud of smoke. You can't see more than a few feet. You can't breathe properly. You're wearing 50 pounds of armor that makes every movement exhausting. Your horse is panicking, trying to flee the smoke and the pain of arrow strikes. And from everywhere, ahead, behind, left, right, you hear the whistling of arrows in flight, the screams of horses, the cries of dying men, the clang of arrows hitting armor. You try to charge in the direction you think the enemy might be, but you can't see them. You emerge from the smoke only to see Mongol riders 100 yards away, sitting calmly on their horses, firing methodically into the cloud. You try to close the distance, but they simply wheel and move away, maintaining that perfect killing range. By the time you reach where they were, they're somewhere else and you're back in the smoke screen, and the arrows are still falling. Some knights tried to turn back, to retreat to where they thought their infantry might be. But they were disoriented, confused about directions, and the Mongols had positioned forces specifically to cut off retreat. Knights attempting to flee found fresh Mongol cavalry in their path, blocking escape, driving them back into the killing zone. Other knights dismounted, thinking they would have better stability and could form a defensive shield wall. This was actually a reasonable tactical decision under some circumstances. Dismounted knights in close formation could be very difficult for cavalry to break. But these weren't ordinary cavalry, and the Mongols had no intention of trying to break them with charges. The dismounted knights, now unable to move quickly, became even easier targets for the horse archers circling at bow range. Arrows punched through mail, found gaps at armpit and groin, struck faces and necks. A knight in full armor could potentially survive many arrow hits to the body and limbs, but not dozens of them. Not hundreds. The slaughter continued for hours. The Mongols were patient, methodical. They maintained their distance, rotated fresh warriors to the front, never exposed themselves to unnecessary risk. When their quivers emptied, they would ride back to resupply while others took their place, ensuring the arrow storm never ceased. By late afternoon, the smoke began to clear, dispersed by the wind, or perhaps the Mongols simply stopped generating it once the European cavalry was sufficiently disorganized. What emerged from that clearing fog was a vision of hell that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The field of dead. The plain was carpeted with bodies. Knights in their expensive armor lay twisted and broken, some still moving weakly, others clearly dead. Horses, those magnificent destriers that each represented wealth equivalent to several farms, lay dead and dying, their suffering perhaps even more pitiful than that of the men. Some groups of knights had managed to form small defensive positions, shields locked together, wounded men in the center. The Mongols ignored them for the moment. These stationary targets could be dealt with later. The priority was preventing any organized retreat. Duke Henry, with his personal guard of perhaps 50 to 100 knights, attempted to fight their way clear. They formed a tight group, protecting each other, trying to make their way back toward where they believed their infantry to be. It was a running battle that stretched across miles. Every few hundred yards, Mongol cavalry would attempt to surround the Duke's party, and Henry's knights, among the finest warriors in Poland, would fight them off with desperate courage. Swords rang against armor. Horses screamed. Men died on both sides, though the Mongols were careful to avoid extended melees where European strength and armor would give them an advantage. But the Mongols had advantages in numbers, mobility, and fresh horses. Henry's party was exhausted, wounded, with dying horses barely able to carry their armored riders. The protective circle grew smaller as knights fell one by one. Sources differ on exactly how Duke Henry died. Some accounts say he was unhorsed and killed in the final melee. Others say he was wounded by an arrow and fell from his horse, then was killed by Mongol warriors. One particularly detailed account claims he almost escaped, making it nearly to the forests west of the battlefield, only to be overtaken at the last moment. What is certain is that Duke Henry II the Pious died that day, his body left on the field with thousands of his warriors. The Mongols, following their custom, cut off his head. They would later mount it on a spear and parade it around the walls of Legnica, showing the terrified inhabitants what had become of their duke. The infantry's doom. While the smokescreen massacre destroyed the European cavalry, the infantry that had been left behind faced their own nightmare. When the cavalry charged in pursuit of the Mongols, the infantry had tried to follow, moving at a fast walk or light jog, as fast as men in armor carrying weapons could move. But they had no chance of keeping up with galloping horses. Within 20 minutes, the cavalry had disappeared over the horizon, leaving the infantry advancing across an empty plain. The infantry commanders halted their advance, unsure what to do. Should they continue forward to support the cavalry? Stand their ground? Retreat to a defensive position? While they debated, Mongol light cavalry appeared on both flanks. These were not the same Mongol forces that were destroying the cavalry. These were separate units that had been positioned specifically to attack the infantry once it became separated from the cavalry. Classic Mongol tactics: divide the enemy's forces, then destroy each part separately. The Mongol cavalry swept in from both sides simultaneously, a classic pincer attack. They didn't charge directly at the infantry. European infantry in formation with long pikes could be dangerous to cavalry. Instead, they circled at bow range, perhaps 100 to 150 yards out, and began shooting. European crossbowmen tried to respond, but it was hopeless. A crossbowman could fire perhaps 3 bolts per minute at best. A Mongol archer could fire 10 arrows in the same time. The crossbowmen were being outkilled at a ratio of more than 3 to 1, and that's before accounting for the fact that the Mongols were moving targets on horseback while the crossbowmen were stationary and exposed. The European infantry tried to maintain their formation, shields up, waiting for the arrow storm to end so they could advance. But there were always more arrows. The Mongols had supplies sufficient for extended fighting. They could and would shoot until every European was dead if necessary. After perhaps an hour of this treatment, the European infantry broke. The levied peasants, who had minimal training and equipment, fled first. Then the professional soldiers began to waver. Finally, even the veteran troops broke ranks and ran. The Mongol cavalry pursued. This was what they had been trained for, what their horses had been bred for, running down fleeing infantry. It was barely even combat. It was slaughter. Fleeing men were shot in the back, cut down by swords, trampled under horses' hooves. Some tried to surrender, throwing down weapons, kneeling, calling out for mercy. The Mongols killed them anyway. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was policy. The Mongols wanted survivors to spread tales of horror, to terrorize other European forces. But they needed fewer survivors, not more. Most of the European infantry that had fought that day would never see another sunrise. Chapter 5. Aftermath of April 9th. The grisly accounting. After the battle, after the last resisting Europeans had been killed or captured, after the Mongols had swept the battlefield killing the wounded, came the body count. The Mongols had developed a system for this, perfected over decades of warfare across Asia. They would cut the right ear from every fallen enemy soldier, collect these ears in sacks, and deliver them to the commanders for counting. It was efficient, accurate, and thoroughly dehumanizing, reducing human beings to body parts to be tallied like livestock. According to reports that eventually reached King Louis IX of France, The Mongols filled 9 large sacks with human ears after the Battle of Legnica. If we assume each sack held around 2,000 ears, that suggests at least 18,000 dead. Some historians argue the sacks might have been smaller, suggesting casualties more in the 10,000 to 12,000 range. Others suggest they were larger, implying casualties might have exceeded 20,000. What's certain is that Duke Henry's army was effectively annihilated. Of the 25,000 to 30,000 men who had deployed that morning on the field of Legnica, perhaps only a few thousand, maybe as few as 1,000 survived. Most of those were from the baggage train and camp followers who had fled early, or wounded men left for dead who somehow managed to survive. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers, those elite warriors who had charged so bravely into the Mongol trap, were virtually wiped out. Of the several hundred who fought at Legnica, contemporary sources suggest only 3 Templars and 2 Hospitallers survived. These professional soldiers, men who had fought against Muslim armies in the Holy Land, men who were supposed to be the finest warriors in Christendom, had been slaughtered like cattle. The Polish nobility suffered devastating losses. Dozens of nobles and their retainers died in the pursuit. Entire family lines were extinguished in a single afternoon. The political and military leadership of several Polish duchies was effectively decapitated. And the Mongol casualties? Minimal. Most estimates suggest a few hundred at most, perhaps as few as 200 to 300 dead. Some Mongols certainly died during the initial archery exchanges and when Duke Henry's personal guard fought to the death. But for the most part, the Mongol tactics had worked exactly as designed, allowing them to destroy an enemy army many times their size while suffering almost no losses themselves. The kill ratio was staggering, possibly 30 or 40 Europeans dead for every Mongol killed. This was not warfare as medieval Europe understood it. This was scientific extermination. The news spreads. King Wenceslaus of Bohemia, marching with his 50,000 men to join Duke Henry, received word of the disaster the next day. He immediately halted his advance and began building defensive fortifications, unwilling to face the Mongols without better intelligence and preparation. The Mongol commanders, having achieved their objective of destroying the Polish army, had no interest in fighting another battle immediately. Their horses were tired, their supplies of arrows depleted enough to require restocking, and they had their own casualties to tend to, minor as they were. More importantly, they needed to move south to rejoin Subutai in Hungary. So they did what Mongol armies did so well. They vanished. By the time King Wenceslaus cautiously approached the battlefield, the Mongol force had already disappeared, moving south through the mountains, leaving behind only corpses and devastation. The news of Legnica spread across Europe with the speed of panic. By late April, every kingdom from France to Italy knew that a European army had been annihilated, that one of Poland's most capable commanders was dead, that the Mongols had achieved what seemed impossible. Panic gripped the continent. Kingdoms mobilized. Cities built up their defenses. Monasteries hid their treasures. Nobles sent their families to distant castles. The Pope called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Christian Europe itself. In Paris, monks stayed up through the night, copying manuscripts and hiding them in cellars, terrified that the Mongols would come and destroy all the learning of Christendom. In Venice, merchants began hoarding supplies, knowing that if Hungary fell, trade with the East would be cut off for years. In Rome, the Pope and cardinals debated whether this was the apocalypse itself, whether these Mongol riders were the riders of the biblical revelation. But the Mongols were not interested in Western Europe, not yet. They had a more immediate target, While Europe panicked over Legnica, Subutai's main army was approaching its destination in Hungary. King Bela IV waited with his 60,000 men along the Sejo River, confident that his army, the largest Hungary had ever assembled, would be able to stop the Mongol invasion where the Poles had failed. He was about to learn that Legnica had not been a defeat. It had been a preview, a demonstration, a warning of what the Mongols could do when they were just a diversionary force, when they were under time pressure, when they weren't really trying. The real battle, the battle where Subutai would demonstrate the full power of Mongol warfare, was about to begin, and it would make Legnica look like a minor skirmish. Continue to Part 3 for the ultimate horror. April 11th, 1241, when Subutai the Undefeated faced King Bela's 60,000 men at the Sejo River in the Battle of Mohi, and showed Europe what true devastation looked like. Other Mongol tactics included the Tuluma or standard sweep, a large-scale encirclement where multiple Chumans would converge on an enemy from different directions simultaneously, surrounding them completely. The Nurge, a hunting technique adapted for war, where a huge line of warriors would sweep forward, driving the enemy before them like game animals, then closing in for the kill. The Karash, using prisoners or captured civilians as a human shield, forcing the enemy to either kill their own people or face the Mongol attack without being able to fight back effectively. Night attacks and surprise assaults, uncommon in European warfare where battles were typically conducted by daylight and often scheduled in advance. Psychological warfare, including spreading terror through deliberately brutal treatment of captured cities, building pyramids of skulls, and ensuring that stories of Mongol atrocities spread far and wide. The goal was to make enemies surrender without fighting, saving Mongol lives. All of these tactics shared common elements. They relied on superior mobility, better intelligence gathering, more sophisticated coordination, and the willingness to fight in ways that Europeans considered dishonorable or cowardly. European military culture valued direct confrontation, standing one's ground, fighting bravely even when outnumbered. The Mongols valued winning by whatever means necessary. In a battle between a brave man fighting with honor and a smart man fighting to win, the smart man usually wins. Europe was about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. Chapter 2. The Man Who Never Lost. Subutai, the blacksmith's son who conquered a continent. If the Mongol army was a sword, then Subutai was the hand that wielded it. And he wielded it with a skill that has rarely been matched in all of military history. Born around 1176 in northern Mongolia, Subutai came from humble origins. His father was a blacksmith of the Uryankai tribe, forest dwellers who were considered crude and unsophisticated by the horse-riding Mongols of the steppes. The Uryankai were barely even considered Mongols. They were subjects, tribute payers, people who lived on the fringes of Mongol society. Young Subutai didn't even know how to ride a horse properly when he joined Temujin's army at age 14. Temujin, who would later be known as Genghis Khan, was at that time just a rising warlord, one among many fighting for supremacy on the Mongol steppes. But Subutai had something more valuable than horsemanship or noble lineage. He had genius. By the time of the European invasion in 1241, Subutai was 65 years old, ancient by the standards of medieval warriors who rarely lived past 50. He had been campaigning for 50 years, fighting in some of the most brutal conflicts in human history, and he had never lost a battle. Read that again, 50 years of active combat command, and never lost a battle. Not once. His record of conquest was staggering. He had been one of Genghis Khan's primary generals during the conquest of northern China, helping to destroy the Jin dynasty. He had led armies deep into Russia, crushing the Russian principalities and establishing Mongol dominance over the entire region. He had devastated Georgia and Armenia, conquering mountain kingdoms that seemed impregnable. He had annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in Central Asia. In terms of territory conquered, Subutai had no equal in history. He commanded forces that conquered more land than Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte combined. From Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia, this was all Subutai's work. But he wasn't just a conqueror. He was a strategic genius who thought on a continental scale. Most medieval generals struggled to coordinate the movements of a few thousand men operating within sight of each other. Subutai routinely commanded campaigns involving multiple armies, each numbering tens of thousands of men, operating hundreds or even thousands of miles apart, all converging on their targets with perfect timing. During the invasion of Russia in 1223, Subutai commanded two Chumans, about 20,000 men, that operated completely independently from the main Mongol army for over a year, conquering territory, gathering intelligence, and then rejoining the main force exactly when and where they were needed. His planning for the European invasion showed this same continental-scale vision. 3 separate Mongol armies would invade Hungary through different routes. Batu Khan through the southern Carpathian passes, Shurban along the Danube, and Subutai himself from the north. Meanwhile, a 4th force under Princes Kadin and Baidar would invade Poland as a diversion. This wasn't just about dividing forces. It was about creating a strategic situation where the enemy couldn't possibly defend everywhere, couldn't concentrate their forces, couldn't predict where the main blow would fall. It was about forcing the Europeans to make impossible choices. Defend Poland or Hungary. Concentrate forces or spread them out. Wait for the Mongols to attack or march out to meet them. Every choice the Europeans made would be the wrong choice, because Subutai had already planned for every possible European response. At 65, Subutai was still personally leading armies in the field, still making tactical decisions in the heat of battle, still innovating and adapting. His mind, sharpened by 50 years of warfare, had become the most dangerous weapon the Mongols possessed. And in April 1241, he would demonstrate exactly why he had never lost a battle. The invasion begins. The world turned red. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe began in early 1241, and it came like a tsunami. The Polish cities fell one after another. Lublin was captured and burned. Zawichost was destroyed. Sandomierz, a major trading center, was besieged and taken. Its inhabitants either slaughtered or enslaved, its buildings reduced to ash. On March 3, 1241, the Mongols appeared outside Krakow, the capital of Poland, one of the great cities of Eastern Europe. Duke Boleslaw V abandoned the city, fleeing west to rally reinforcements. The citizens, in panic, tried to flee as well, but many were caught by Mongol cavalry sweeping around the city. March 24th, Palm Sunday, the Mongols entered Krakow. What happened next became one of the most famous incidents of the invasion. As the Mongols approached, a watchman atop St. Mary's Basilica saw them coming and began playing a warning tune on his trumpet, the Hejnal Marigny, a traditional Polish hymn. The clear notes rang out across the city, warning citizens to flee, to hide, to prepare. A Mongol archer, demonstrating the incredible skill and range of the composite bow, shot an arrow that flew hundreds of feet through the air and struck the trumpeter in the throat, cutting off the tune mid-note. The city was set ablaze. The great wooden buildings that had stood for centuries burned throughout the day and night. Thousands of citizens who had not escaped were killed or captured. The cathedral, the markets, the noble houses, all reduced to smoking ruins. To this day, every hour on the hour, a trumpeter plays that same hymn from St. Mary's Basilica in Krakow. And every hour, the tune cuts off abruptly at the same note, commemorating the moment when the Mongol arrow struck 783 years ago. By early April, all of southern Poland was either under Mongol control or abandoned. Its population fled westward carrying tales of horror. The Mongols had moved with incredible speed, covering hundreds of miles in just weeks, destroying cities that had stood for centuries, leaving a trail of devastation that would scar the landscape for generations. But Poland was never the main target. Poland was a diversion, a way to draw European forces away from Hungary, the real prize. In Hungary, King Bela IV had been trying to rally his forces for weeks, sending messengers to neighboring kingdoms begging for aid, calling up the Hungarian nobility and their retainers, mobilizing every able-bodied man who could hold a weapon. The response was disappointing. The Holy Roman Empire, embroiled in its ongoing conflict between Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX, sent minimal help. The German princes, suspicious of Hungarian motives, held back their forces. Duke Frederick of Austria brought a small contingent but seemed more interested in using the crisis to extract territorial concessions from Bela than in actually fighting the Mongols. By April 1241, Bela had managed to assemble approximately 60,000 men along the Sejo River, the largest army Hungary had ever fielded. It included heavy cavalry, infantry, crossbowmen, and contingents from various subject peoples. It should have been enough to face the Mongol threat. It would not be enough. As April progressed, two European forces prepared to meet the Mongol threat. In Poland, Duke Henry II the Pious had assembled a coalition army at Legnica in Silesia. In Hungary, King Bela's massive force waited along the Sejo River. Both armies were composed of brave men, experienced soldiers, proud warriors confident in their cause and their strength. Neither army understood that they were about to face something unprecedented in European history. The 2 days of darkness were about to begin. The 2 days of darkness. How the Mongols shattered Europe in 48 hours. Part 3. The Bridge of Death, April 11th, 1241, where Subutai showed Europe what perfect warfare looked like. Chapter 6. The Calm Before Annihilation, April 10th, 1241, the night before. The evening of April 10th settled over the Hungarian encampment along the Sejo River like a funeral shroud. 60,000 men, the entire military might of the Kingdom of Hungary, sat in their fortified camp, watching fires burn on the opposite bank where the Mongol army waited. King Bela IV stood in his command tent, staring at maps by candlelight, but his mind was elsewhere. News of Legnica had reached him that morning. Duke Henry was dead. An entire Polish-German army had been annihilated in a matter of hours. The Mongol diversionary force had accomplished its mission and was reportedly moving south to join the main Mongol army, the army that Bela now faced. He should have felt confident. His position was strong, arguably the strongest defensive position one could hope for against a cavalry-heavy enemy. The Sejo River provided a natural barrier, wide and swift with spring melt, difficult to cross. There was only one stone bridge at the town of Mohi, and Bela had positioned guards to defend it. His army had constructed a fortified camp surrounded by a ring of wagons chained together, a mobile fortress that should be impregnable to cavalry assault. And his numbers were substantial, 60,000 men. Even accounting for camp followers and non-combatants, he had at least 50,000 fighting men. Against Subutai's forces of perhaps 40,000, he had numeric superiority. Against the reunited Mongol army, including Khadan and Baydar's forces from Poland, the numbers would be roughly even. But King Bela could not shake a sense of doom. His kingdom was fracturing even as he tried to defend it. The Hungarian nobles, proud and fractious, had barely cooperated in assembling this army. Many had arrived late. Some had not come at all, making excuses or claiming they needed to defend their own lands. There were whispers that some nobles actually wanted the king to be defeated, hoping a military disaster would force him to grant them greater autonomy. The Cumans, Turkish nomads whom Bela had invited into Hungary as allies, people who actually knew how to fight the Mongols, had fled south weeks earlier. After riots broke out and their Khan was murdered by xenophobic Hungarian mobs, the Cumans had departed in rage, burning Hungarian villages as they went. Bela had lost his most valuable military asset and gained thousands of refugees and destroyed villages in the process. Duke Frederick II of Austria, supposedly an ally, had brought a small force but seemed more interested in exploiting the situation than helping. He had already extracted territorial concessions from Bela as payment for his assistance, and his troops were more concerned with looting Hungarian supplies than preparing for battle. So Bela stood alone, with an army that barely trusted him, facing an enemy that had never lost a battle, commanded by a general who had conquered half of Asia. Majesty, Duke Frederick entered the tent without announcement, his expression neutral in that carefully calculated way that powerful men adopt when delivering bad news. The men report that Mongol scouts have been observed across the river throughout the day. Small parties, moving constantly, watching us. And our scouts? Bela asked, though he already knew the answer. Any who approach the opposite bank are shot before they can get close enough to see anything useful. The Mongol archers. They're as good as the stories say, Majesty. Better, perhaps.
Bela nodded slowly.
Of course they were. Everything about the Mongols was as good as, or worse than, the stories said. That night, as darkness fell over both encampments, the two armies presented very different aspects. In the Hungarian camp, men tried to sleep, many for the last time in their lives. Priests moved among them, hearing confessions, administering last rites to those who requested it. Some men gambled, trying to distract themselves from their fears. Others sharpened weapons, checked armor, wrote letters to families they might never see again. Across the Sejo River, the Mongol camp was eerily quiet. No songs, no shouting, no sounds of revelry or nervous activity. Just the occasional movement of shadows, the soft neighing of horses, and an air of patient, predatory waiting. Subutai was in his tent, finalizing plans with his commanders. The old general, at 65, should have been retired, living out his final years in comfort in distant Mongolia. Instead, he was here, about to execute one of the most audacious battle plans of his long career. The Hungarian position was strong, too strong for a direct assault. The Sejo River was a formidable obstacle. The fortified wagon circle would be difficult for cavalry to break. A frontal assault across the single bridge would be suicidal. So Subutai was not going to make a frontal assault. He was going to turn that strong defensive position into a death trap. The plan required perfect timing, coordination between forces operating miles apart, and engineering work that would have to be done under enemy fire in the dead of night. It required his troops to maintain discipline during what would appear, to the Hungarians, to be a desperate and disorganized assault. In other words, it was exactly the kind of impossible plan that Subutai had been executing successfully for 50 years. April 11th, 1241, 2 a.m. The night crossing. The attack began in the deepest hours before dawn, when human alertness is at its lowest, when even trained guards struggle to stay awake, when the world seems suspended between day and night. It started with a sound that Hungarian guards at the bridge had never heard before. A strange whistling followed by explosions. Catapults positioned on the eastern bank of the Sejo River began hurling projectiles across the water into the Hungarian camp. But these weren't ordinary stones. Some sources describe explosive devices, primitive bombs containing gunpowder, naphtha, and shrapnel. Whether these truly existed or whether later chroniclers were describing something they couldn't fully understand remains debated. What isn't debated is the effect. Explosions ripped through the darkness, setting wagons on fire, killing sleeping soldiers, creating instant chaos and confusion. The Hungarian camp, which moments before had been mostly asleep, erupted into panicked activity. Men scrambled for weapons, trying to understand where the attack was coming from, whether the Mongols were crossing the river, whether this was the main assault or a diversion. Under cover of this bombardment and confusion, the main Mongol assault on the Mohi bridge began. The stone bridge over the Sejo at Mohi was perhaps 15 feet wide and 200 feet long, a narrow choke point that should have been easily defensible. Duke Bela had positioned about 1,000 men to guard it, with orders to hold at all costs. These were good troops, well-equipped, positioned behind improvised barricades at the western end of the bridge. The Mongols charged the bridge in waves. The first wave consisted of heavily armored Mongol cavalry. Yes, the Mongols had heavy cavalry too, not just the famous horse archers. These warriors wore lamellar armor, carried shields, and wielded lances and swords. They were designed for exactly this kind of brutal, close-quarters fighting. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. The narrow space meant that only a few men could fight at a time. The Hungarians, fighting from behind their barricades, had the advantage of position. They pushed back the first Mongol assault, then the second, then the third. Bodies began to pile up on the bridge, making footing treacherous, the stones slick with blood. The battle for the bridge continued for hours. Wave after wave of Mongol warriors charged forward, and wave after wave the Hungarians threw them back. Hungarian defenders died, struck by arrows from Mongol archers providing covering fire, or killed in the brutal melee combat on the bridge itself. But they were replaced by fresh troops from the camp. To the Hungarian commanders, this looked like desperation. The Mongols were throwing men away in futile frontal assaults, suffering heavy casualties, achieving nothing. It seemed that the Mongol reputation was overblown after all. When forced to fight on European terms, in a situation where their mobility and archery couldn't dominate, they were just men, and they could be defeated. What the Hungarians didn't know was that the bridge assault was a diversion, though the Mongol warriors dying there didn't know they were sacrificial either. Subutai needed to keep Hungarian attention focused on the bridge, needed them to believe that was where the main attack was coming, needed them to commit troops to the defense. While the battle for the bridge raged, two other operations were underway in the darkness. 6 miles upstream, hidden by darkness and the sound of battle, Mongol engineers were constructing a pontoon bridge across the Sejo River. These engineers were Chinese and Persian specialists who had been integrated into the Mongol army during previous conquests. They were among the most skilled in the world at this kind of rapid military engineering. They worked with incredible speed, assembling a floating bridge from pre-prepared materials that had been transported specifically for this purpose. Mongol archers positioned on both banks provided covering fire, shooting into the darkness at any movement on the opposite shore. The work was done in near total silence. No shouting, no unnecessary noise that might alert Hungarian scouts. Within 3 hours, the pontoon bridge was complete and Mongol cavalry were beginning to cross. Simultaneously, even more remarkably, other Mongol forces were crossing the river through the marshes. The Sejo River's banks in some areas dissolved into wetlands that the Hungarians had considered impassable. The water was waist-deep or deeper, the mud thick enough to suck down a horse, cold enough to cause hypothermia, dangerous in 100 different ways. No sensible commander would try to cross there, especially in darkness. Subutai's warriors crossed anyway. Small groups of lightly armored Mongol cavalry, leading their hardy steppe ponies by the reins, waded through water that sometimes came up to their chests. They moved with agonizing slowness, feeling their way through mud and reeds, sometimes sinking up to their thighs, struggling forward step by step. The crossing took hours. Some men and horses were lost, sucked down by mud, or drowned in unexpected deep spots. But enough made it through. By dawn, when the darkness finally began to give way to gray morning light, the situation had transformed completely. The Hungarians were no longer defending a strong position. They were already surrounded. Chapter 7, April 11th. The day Hungary died. Dawn and the realization of doom. King Bela emerged from his tent as the first light of dawn spread across the sky. He had not slept. How could anyone sleep through the explosions, the sounds of battle at the bridge, the chaos of a night attack? What he saw in the growing light froze his blood. Mongol cavalry were not just attacking the bridge. They were on the western bank of the river. Thousands of them, forming up in battle lines, their positions suggesting they had been there for some time. Some were to the north of the Hungarian camp. These must have crossed on the pontoon bridge. Others were emerging from the marshes to the south, muddy and exhausted but ready to fight. And more Mongols were still crossing the bridge, which they must have finally captured during the night, probably in the chaos and darkness when no one could be sure what was happening where. The Hungarian position, so strong the night before, had become a trap. The fortified wagon circle that was supposed to protect them now penned them in, preventing quick movement or reorganization. The river that was supposed to be a barrier had been bridged or forded in multiple places. The Mongols were on the same side of the river, had position on the Hungarians' flanks, and were still pouring reinforcements across. Bela tried to rally his forces to form battle lines to create some kind of coherent defense. His commanders rode through the camp shouting orders, trying to organize the chaos into something resembling an army. But it was too late for careful organization. The Mongols were not going to give them time. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, the classic Mongol Tuluma encirclement that Subutai had perfected over decades. Heavy Mongol cavalry charged the Hungarian center where Bela had positioned his own heavy cavalry. At the same time, lighter Mongol cavalry swept around both flanks. Mongol archers on the eastern bank of the river continued their bombardment. The stone-throwing catapults adjusted their aim, now targeting specific concentrations of Hungarian forces with devastating accuracy. The Hungarian knights, brave and heavily armored, tried to mount a cavalry charge. It was what they knew, what they had trained for their entire lives, the traditional response to any attack in medieval warfare. For the Mongols, it was exactly what they had expected and prepared for. As the Hungarian heavy cavalry charged forward, the Mongol center appeared to falter and give ground. the feigned withdrawal that had destroyed Duke Henry at Legnica 2 days earlier. But this time, some Hungarian commanders recognized the trap. They tried to hold their formation, tried to resist the temptation to pursue, screaming orders at their knights to stay in line. But their flanks were being destroyed. Mongol horse archers were systematically cutting down the Hungarian infantry. The camp was burning. Men were dying by the hundreds. The commanders had no choice. Push forward or die where they stood. The Hungarian knights charged into the carefully prepared killing ground. The systematic destruction. What happened next was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a systematic, scientific slaughter that demonstrated exactly why the Mongols had conquered half the known world. The Mongol forces executed a coordinated encirclement with precision that would be impressive in a modern army with radios and real-time communication. For a medieval force using only flag signals and predetermined plans, it was extraordinary. As the Hungarian cavalry pushed forward, the Mongol center gave way, but only so far. The Mongols maintained their cohesion, stayed within supporting distance of each other, and most importantly, never let the Hungarians close to sword range. The flanking forces closed in, and suddenly the Hungarians found themselves in a double envelopment. Mongol forces on all sides, arrows pouring in from every direction. The Hungarians tried to form defensive formations, but they were being shot at from 360 degrees. No matter which direction they faced their shields, arrows came from behind and from the sides. The Mongol composite bows, firing from 100 to 150 yards, could penetrate Hungarian mail armor. The Hungarian horses, less armored than their riders, began falling in large numbers. Once unhorsed, a knight in 60 pounds of armor could barely move. They became stationary targets, shot repeatedly until they stopped moving. Some Hungarian forces tried to retreat back to the fortified camp, hoping the wagon circle would provide protection. But Subutai had anticipated this as well. The Mongols had deliberately left a gap in their encirclement, a corridor to the southwest that appeared to offer an escape route from the hell of the battlefield. Hungarian soldiers, seeing this apparent opening, fled toward it by the thousands. Units that might have continued fighting if they thought they had no choice instead broke ranks and ran for the gap. It was another trap, one of the most psychologically sophisticated tactics in Subutai's arsenal. The escape corridor didn't lead to safety. It led into open terrain where Mongol cavalry could pursue at will, where there were no fortifications, no forests, no natural defensive positions. And the Mongols had positioned fresh cavalry specifically to pursue anyone who took that route. What had seemed like a path to survival became a gauntlet of death. Mongol riders pursued the fleeing Hungarians for miles, picking them off one by one or in small groups. Men who might have fought bravely if they believed they had no choice instead died exhausted and alone, shot in the back while running, far from the battlefield, with no comrades to witness their deaths or honor their memory. This was psychological warfare at its absolute finest. Subutai understood that once you broke an army's will to fight, once you turned warriors into terrified fugitives, they became easy to kill. The Mongols were not just destroying a military force, they were destroying the psychological foundation that held that force together. King Bela's flight. King Bela IV, surrounded by his personal guard, realized early in the battle that the day was lost. There would be no miraculous rally, no divine intervention, no tactical brilliance that could save them now. The Mongol plan was too perfect, too well executed, too overwhelming. If he stayed, he would die. And with him would die any chance of Hungary organizing resistance, any hope of rebuilding the army, any possibility of eventual victory. So Bela ran. And in running, he probably saved his kingdom, though that would become apparent only much later. With a core group of perhaps 100 loyal knights, Bela fought his way toward the southwestern escape corridor. Unlike the common soldiers fleeing in panic, the king's group stayed together, maintained some semblance of military discipline, protected each other. It was still a desperate running battle that lasted for miles. Mongol cavalry tried repeatedly to surround and capture or kill the Hungarian king. Taking him alive would be a tremendous propaganda victory. Killing him would decapitate Hungarian resistance entirely. But Bela's personal guard were among Hungary's finest warriors, and they fought with desperate, suicidal courage. They knew that if the king fell, Hungary fell. They sold their lives to buy the king's seconds and yards. Men threw themselves at Mongol riders, accepting certain death to slow the pursuit. Knights with wounded horses dismounted and continued fighting on foot, holding positions just long enough for Bela to get farther away before being cut down. The protective circle around the king grew smaller with every mile. 100 knights became 80, then 60, then 40. Horses died, men died, but the core group kept moving, kept fighting, kept the king alive and moving forward. Bela eventually made it to the forests south of the battlefield, where Mongol cavalry was less effective in the dense trees. From there, a much reduced group, perhaps 20 men, all wounded, all exhausted, continued their flight westward and then south toward Croatia and the Adriatic coast. King Bela IV would survive. He would spend months as a fugitive, constantly moving to stay ahead of Mongol patrols, eventually reaching the safety of fortified coastal cities. He would live to rebuild his kingdom, to learn from this catastrophe, to transform Hungary into a nation that could resist the Mongols. But tens of thousands of his subjects would not. Chapter 8. The Pursuit and the Counting. The killing continues. The Battle of Mohi officially ended by mid-afternoon of April 11th, when organized Hungarian resistance collapsed completely. But the killing continued for days. Mongol cavalry pursued fleeing Hungarians across the entire country. No one was safe. Soldiers trying to reach their homes were cut down on the roads. Peasants hiding in forests were hunted like animals. Towns that tried to shelter refugees were besieged and burned. The Mongols were implementing a terror campaign designed to break the will of the entire Hungarian population. This wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated policy, refined over decades of conquest. The goal was to make resistance seem futile, to make submission seem like the only rational choice. Roger of Apulia, an Italian archbishop who witnessed the aftermath, wrote an account so horrifying that some modern historians initially doubted its accuracy. Then archaeological evidence confirmed it. For 2 days after the battle, the roads leading from Mohi were carpeted with corpses. In some places, the bodies were piled so high they blocked passage. The ground for miles around was stained red with blood. Dogs and wolves grew fat feeding on Christian flesh. Crows darkened the sky in such numbers that they blocked the sun. He continued, "The Mongols pursued the fleeing Hungarians with a diligence that surpassed belief. Any man they overtook was killed, regardless of whether he was armed or had surrendered. Villages that offered shelter to refugees were burned to the ground, their inhabitants slaughtered. Even women and children were not spared. The Mongols killed all equally or took them as slaves. The Hungarian casualties at Mohi are difficult to determine precisely. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers, either from genuine confusion or for propaganda purposes. But combining multiple sources and modern archaeological evidence, Historians estimate. Immediate battle deaths: 10,000 to 25,000 soldiers killed during the actual battle and immediate pursuit on April 11th. Deaths during the extended pursuit: an additional 10,000 to 20,000 soldiers killed over the following days and weeks. Total military casualties: approximately 20,000 to 40,000 out of the 60,000-man army. The true number was probably somewhere in the middle of these ranges, perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 Hungarian soldiers killed. This represented not just a defeat, but the complete annihilation of Hungarian military power. But the horror didn't stop with the military casualties. In the months following Mohi, the Mongols swept across Hungary, destroying cities, burning villages, killing or enslaving civilians on a massive scale. King Bela later estimated that half of Hungary's pre-invasion population of 2 million people died during the Mongol occupation. While this was certainly an exaggeration, chroniclers always exaggerate enemy atrocities. Modern archaeological and demographic studies suggest that 20 to 40% of Hungary's population may have died during this period. That's 400,000 to 800,000 people. Men, women, and children. Dead from direct violence, disease, starvation, and displacement. For comparison, the Black Death, which devastated Europe a century later, killed approximately 30 to 40% of the population. The Mongol invasion of Hungary, concentrated in just a few months, may have been proportionally even more deadly. The Mongol casualties and the Mongol losses, minimal as always. The battle for the Mohi Bridge had been genuinely bloody. Perhaps 500 to 1,000 Mongol warriors died in those brutal close-quarters fights on the narrow stone span. Some additional casualties were incurred during the actual battle when Hungarian knights managed to close to melee range before being overwhelmed. Total Mongol casualties at Mohi are estimated at 1,000 to 2,500 men, perhaps 5% of their force. Significant losses by Mongol standards, where battles were usually won with even fewer casualties, but still remarkable considering they had destroyed an army twice their size. The kill ratio was approximately 10 to 1, possibly 15 to 1 depending on which casualty estimates you use. 10 or 15 Hungarians dead for every Mongol killed. This, combined with Legnica's even more lopsided casualties, demonstrated conclusively that the Mongols had achieved a level of military sophistication that Europe simply could not match. Chapter 9. What came after Europe transformed? The Mongols continue. December 1241. After Mohi, the Mongols swept across Hungary like a biblical plague. Cities fell one after another. Pest, Hungary's largest city, was besieged and taken. Its inhabitants were given a choice: surrender and be enslaved, or resist and be killed. Many chose to set fire to their own houses rather than let the Mongols have them. The city was left as smoking ruins, its population of 12,000 either dead or enslaved. Esztergom, the religious capital, fell after desperate resistance. Gran and Vac were destroyed. Varad held out for months but eventually fell. Across the Hungarian plains, dozens of towns and hundreds of villages were burned. The countryside was depopulated. The Mongols raided into Austria, probing the defenses of Vienna. They sent parties into Croatia hunting for King Bela. They established control over nearly all of Hungary east of the Danube. All of Western Europe watched in horror, mobilizing, building defenses, knowing they were next. Kingdoms that had been enemies for generations began discussing alliances. The Pope called for unity against the Eastern threat. Scholars and monks copied manuscripts and hid them in caves, terrified that the Mongols would burn libraries as they had burned cities. And then, in early 1242, the Mongols left. They didn't retreat in defeat. They simply withdrew, pulling back from Hungary, from Austria, from Poland, disappearing back into the eastern steppes as suddenly as they had appeared. Why did they leave? The question that haunts history. The traditional explanation, found in every history textbook, is straightforward. Ogdi Khan, the great Khan in Mongolia, died in December 1241. According to Mongol law, all princes had to return to Karakoram to participate in electing a new great Khan. The European invasion was called off so the commanders could participate in the succession politics. This explanation is tidy, makes sense, and is almost certainly incomplete. The Kurultai, the great assembly to elect a new Khan, wasn't held until 1246, 5 years after the withdrawal. The new great Khan, Gayuk, wasn't chosen until that year. Bata Khan, who commanded the European invasion, never returned to Mongolia at all, refusing to participate in the succession dispute. So why did the Mongols really leave? Modern historians suggest several factors. Diminishing returns. Hungary had been devastated, but not conquered. The capital had fallen, but dozens of stone castles held out. The population, instead of submitting, had fled into fortresses or forests, denying the Mongols the agricultural production they needed to sustain their armies. Strategic calculation. Western Europe represented an even greater challenge. More castles, better organized kingdoms, larger armies. The forces needed to conquer France or Germany would be enormous, and the resistance would be fierce. Political divisions. The Mongol commanders, particularly Bata Khan and Gayuk, who would become the next great Khan, hated each other. Some sources suggest they nearly came to blows during the European campaign. Continuing westward would have required these rivals to cooperate indefinitely, something neither wanted to do. Military realities. The Mongols had suffered casualties, not catastrophic but significant. At Legnica and Mohi combined, they had lost perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 men, roughly 5% of their force. More importantly, the battles had shown that European heavy cavalry, once they abandoned their camp and fought in open battle, were formidable opponents. The castles that held out required resources and time to besiege properly. Subutai, the great strategist, apparently calculated that Europe west of Hungary would cost more to conquer than it was worth, at least with the forces available and with political stability in Mongolia uncertain. So the Mongols withdrew. They took their loot, their slaves, their glory, and they left. Europe breathed again. But Europe had been fundamentally changed. The lessons written in blood, how Bela IV transformed Hungary. King Bela IV emerged from hiding in 1242 to find his kingdom in ruins. Cities burned, villages abandoned, fields untilled, corpses still lying where they had fallen months before. The Hungarian nobility that had been so fractious before the invasion was now humble, chastened by catastrophe. Bela could have despaired. Instead, he transformed Hungary. First, he addressed the military weakness that had made the Mongol victory possible. Before 1241, Hungary had fewer than a dozen stone castles. Within 20 years, Hungary had more than 150 fortified positions, a network of defensive strongholds that would make any future invasion exponentially more difficult. These weren't simple towers. They were sophisticated fortresses built on strategic heights, with walls thick enough to resist siege engines, with wells inside the walls with storage for months of supplies. Bela offered land grants to any noble who would build and maintain such fortresses. The nobles, their arrogance broken by Mohi, agreed enthusiastically. Second, Bela reformed the military itself. He studied Mongol tactics, hired foreign advisors, created a standing army that trained year-round. He tried to incorporate some Mongol methods, greater emphasis on mobility, better coordination, more professional command structure. Third, he rebuilt Hungary's population by welcoming refugees, immigrants, and inviting new groups to settle in depopulated areas. Germans, Cumans, Jews, Armenians, anyone willing to work and fight was welcomed. The transformation worked beyond Bela's wildest hopes. When the Mongols returned in 1285 under Nogai Khan and Talabuga, they found a completely different kingdom. 1285, the Mongols return and fail. In the mid-1280s, a Mongol army of approximately 50,000 men invaded Hungary again. They expected to replicate the easy conquest of 1241. Instead, they met disaster. The Hungarian army refused to meet the Mongols in open battle. They used hit-and-run tactics, harassed supply lines, retreated into fortified positions whenever the Mongols concentrated their forces. It was guerrilla warfare the Hungarians had learned from their defeat. The Mongol army split, with Nogai Khan leading forces into Transylvania, while Talabuga's main army advanced into northern Hungary. But instead of defenseless cities, they found castle after castle, each requiring a siege, each one costing time and lives. Winter came early. Snow blocked the Carpathian passes. Mongol horses, that essential element of their warfare, began dying from lack of fodder. Supply lines collapsed. Near Pest, the Hungarian royal army under King Ladislaus IV met Talabuga's forces in open battle and defeated them. It wasn't a catastrophic defeat like Mohi had been for Hungary. It was a tactical setback. But combined with the weather, the starvation, the castles that wouldn't fall, it was enough. The Mongols withdrew. They had taken some loot from Transylvania, but the invasion was a strategic failure. The Szekely, a Hungarian-speaking group, ambushed the retreating Mongols in mountain passes, inflicting further casualties. The contrast with 1241 could not have been more stark. In 1241, the Mongols had destroyed Hungary in weeks. In 1285, Hungary had successfully repelled a Mongol invasion. The lessons of April 9th and 11th, 1241, had not been forgotten. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Never Left. The Psychological Wound. While Hungary learned to fight the Mongols, Europe never forgot the terror of those 2 days. The Mongol invasion left a psychological scar on European consciousness that lasted for generations. Chronicles from across the continent described the Mongols in terms usually reserved for demons or apocalyptic forces. They were the Tartars, a name derived from Tartarus, the deepest pit of hell in Greek mythology. Medieval writers struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Thomas of Split wrote that the Mongols appeared more like monsters than men, drinking blood and eating raw flesh. Matthew Paris, an English chronicler, reported that they could shoot backwards while riding at full gallop, as if the devil himself guided their arrows. These descriptions weren't entirely wrong. The Mongols could do most of these things, just not supernaturally. But to Europeans who had never seen such tactics, who fought in completely different ways, the Mongol abilities seemed beyond human. The invasion became legend, nightmare, cautionary tale. For generations, European children were told stories of the Tartar hordes, the riders from hell who had almost destroyed Christendom. The real legacy European warfare transformed. But the true legacy wasn't psychological, it was practical. European warfare began to change in response to the Mongol threat. Not immediately, the transformation took generations, but it was real and permanent. Heavy armor began to be seen as a liability rather than an asset. The age of the knight, already slowly declining, accelerated toward its end. Mobility gained new respect. Horse archery, previously dismissed as cowardly, was studied more seriously. Most importantly, European kingdoms began building comprehensive defensive networks. The great stone castles that dot the European landscape today, many were built or strengthened in response to the Mongol threat. The crossbow gained new prominence as a weapon that could match Mongol range while requiring less training. Gunpowder weapons, which the Mongols may have introduced or at least demonstrated at Mohi, began appearing in Europe within decades. Military organization improved. Professional armies gained favor over feudal levies. Coordination and discipline became more valued than individual glory. In short, the 2 days in April 1241 helped push European warfare from medieval to early modern. The lessons of Legnica and Mohi about mobility, combined arms, discipline over bravery would eventually help European armies become the dominant military forces in the world. But that transformation took centuries. In 1241, Europe had simply been outclassed. The numbers don't lie. A statistical apocalypse. Let's review the cold statistics one final time. April 9th, 1241, Legnica *. European forces engaged, 25,000 to 30,000. European casualties, 15,000 to 20,000 dead. Mongol casualties, 200 to 500 dead. Kill ratio, 30 to 1 to 40 to 1. Duration, 4 to 6 hours. April 11th, 1241, Mohi *. European forces engaged, 60,000. European casualties, 25,000 to 30,000 dead in battle, thousands more in pursuit. Mongol casualties, 1,000 to 2,500 dead. Kill ratio, 10 to 1 to 15 to 1. Duration, less than 12 hours. Combined *. Total European forces, 85,000 to 90,000. Total European casualties, 40,000 to 50,000. Total Mongol casualties, 2,000 to 3,000. Overall kill ratio, 15 to 1 to 20 to 1. Total combat time, less than 24 hours spread over 48 hours. In 2 days of actual fighting, the Mongols killed more European soldiers than died at Waterloo. They achieved kill ratios that wouldn't be seen again until the advent of machine guns and artillery in World War I. This wasn't just military defeat. This was the demonstration of a centuries-wide gap in military technology, tactics, training, and organization. The question that haunts, what if? What if the Mongols had continued westward? What if internal Mongol politics hadn't prompted their withdrawal? What if they had decided Western Europe was worth conquering after all?